Well, good morning. I can look out across our auditorium this morning and see several visitors with us, several guests we have. We're certainly glad to have you with us. It's a blessing to us to have you join us for our worship, and we hope that our time together is a blessing to you as well. But most of all, our prayer is that God is glorified and praised in what we do this morning. Y'all, for the past several weeks, we've been in 1 John. We're going to be back there this morning, but we're not going to start there. We're actually going to start in Philippians this morning, and it's going to lead us into our discussion at 1 John. So I want to read something from you from Philippians and talk about a little bit what Paul wrote there. It's in Philippians chapter 3. And Paul is writing about all of the things that he could brag about. All the things that he could consider important. And all the things that he could stand and say, look at me and look at all that I've accomplished. Look at my character and how important I am. And as he goes through these what we have divided in the first few verses of chapter 3, he says, all this stuff could be so important. But in verse 7 he says, but what things were gained to me, these I have counted for loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith. He says, all these things I could consider important, all this stuff that the world tells me and the world tells us that really matters, I look at them now in the context of Jesus and realize they're all just junk. And they don't really matter at all. But if you look a little bit further down in verse 18, some folks have not quite caught on to that. He says, for many a walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. So he's writing there and he's saying, look, I've got something figured out, and I'm telling you this, even weeping over these people, tormented over the fact that they still consider the world to be so important. And if we look at the world we're living in now, we live in what's called the postmodern world, which basically says, and we've talked about this before, I am the God of my own universe. I create my own reality. I create my own morality. I create my own rules, and I do whatever I want as long as I want to. I'm in charge of my life. That's the postmodern approach to where we are. And Paul says, I look at these people. I look at those who consider this world so important. And I look at people around me and I see these people who are still walking in the world and living in the world and putting their faith in the world. And I weep over those people. I'm tormented by their loss because I have found that all these things are junk in the context of Jesus, and yet there are so many who live just for their own satisfaction, their own glory, their own recognition. He said, I'm tormented over that. I cry for these people. My heart breaks for these people. And if we look at that context over in 1 John, look in verse 15 of chapter 2, where John writes, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Do you hear what that said? It didn't say, If you love the world, you can still be kind of living in both places and share this dual identity as part of the world. And I love the world, but I also love God. I can do both. Yeah, I can manage both of those. Now, remember when we talked about, you probably don't remember because it's been too long. I remember because, I said it. That's what I remember. We were talking about the temple. And when Solomon dedicated the temple, he said the Spirit of God came down and filled the temple to the point that the priests had to leave because they couldn't do their work in there because the temple was so full of the Spirit of God. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he tells us we are the temple of God. We are made for His glory. We are made to be filled by His Spirit. Romans chapter 8 tells us we're dwelling place for that Spirit. So if we're living in God, if we're in Him, then His Spirit fills us. And there's no room for anything else. So when we present this living space for God, there shouldn't be anything else in there or room for the world to be living in there with Him. How many of y'all have ever bought a house that someone else has lived in before? A non-new construction house. Okay, imagine this. Okay, you buy this house, you pick a house out, you make an offer, it's accepted, everything's going great. You go to closing, you sign all the paperwork, and you go to the house, and you're moving your stuff in, and you walk into one of the back rooms, and there's still a bunch of furniture in there, and the previous owner is sitting there watching television. And you say, what in the world is going on? And he says, I'm going to keep this room for myself. How many of us would be okay with that? I mean, when we take over a place like that, when we move into a place, we don't want the previous owner or his stuff hanging around. So if you move in and he's sitting back there with his sock feet and his boxer shorts watching football, you're thinking, get your stuff and get out. There's no room for you because this is not where you live anymore. Church, we cannot expect God to want to live in us if we don't kick the world out. So we can't assume that I can live in both places at the same time. I can be in God and in the world because God is not going to accept that as okay. And church, neither should we. We cannot love the world and love God and please Him. And that scares me a little bit to think about. I mean, do y'all really think about this for a moment? I mean, because the world tells us through advertising and all this, you deserve this. Well, why do I deserve that? Well, they don't know me. These advertisers, they don't know what I deserve. But they're going to tell me I deserve this new car. Or I'm not going to be cool enough if I don't have this gadget. Or my life won't be complete if I'm not using their product. They tell us these things and they build us up to think that I'm going to get that because it's going to make me more popular. Or I'm going to get that because it's going to make me look better or sound better or feel better. It's because they're going to tell you that it's all about you. And I appreciated Ron's comments during his prayer. That sometimes we get to the point where we feel like we're the center of our world and we put far too much emphasis on ourselves. Because look at what John writes here. If we love the world, the love of the Father is not in us. It doesn't say the love of the Father is diminished. It doesn't say that the love of the Father is not as strong as it should be. It says the love of the Father is not in us. Now, who of us wants to stand before God with the love of the Father not in us? And yet, when we listen to the world and we love the world tells you, oh no, you are what's important. You are what counts. Your satisfaction, your happiness, your contentment, so you do you. Matter of fact, there's a sign on 202, and y'all have probably seen it. It says, you do you. And there's this really dapper-looking character on there. It's a sharp-dressed man who's, he'd be like, yeah, everybody wants to be him. The you do you. That is being a lover of the world. Look here. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but of the world. We also was mentioned that Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted by the devil in Matthew 4. I think Mark brought that up for us. And what the devil appealed to? Jesus was hungry. And he said, make these rocks bread and you'll be okay. He's appealing to the lust of the flesh right there. Remember somebody else that got really, really hungry and made a really foolish decision just because he was hungry? Being hungry makes us do silly stuff. I'm just going to tell you. Being really hungry can make you do foolish stuff. But the devil tempted Christ through the lust of the flesh with these rocks. You could make them into bread. And he took him up to the top of the temple and he said, cast yourself off the temple and the angels will save you. Pride of life. Your life is what's important. Your life is what matters. Your life is... Oh. And then he took him up to the mountaintop. He said, look out across here. I'll give you all this if you'll just fall down and worship me. The lust of the eyes. I see it and I want it, so I'm going to take it no matter what. And in each case, as I pointed out, Jesus answered Satan with the word. And said, I'm not going to fall for that. And each sin that we commit can fall into those categories. Each time we choose the world, it falls into one of those. But what is the root of all sin? I'm just going to tell you the root of all sin, in my humble opinion, is selfishness. Because we have the will of God, and He says, here's what I expect from you. And yet when we sin, I am saying to God, I know what you want, but I want something different. I know, Father, I know you said I need to love you more than anything, but I love this world. I love the things in this world. And the world tells me that that's the right way to feel. So how can we then justify this moment when we say, oh, I love God. I love Him. I'm a member of His family. And yet then we still fall victim to the great liar. Do not love the world or the things in the world. You know, I see, and you all see this too, I'm sure. People who are so consumed by the world. We can look around us at the world and see people who are just absolutely consumed by the world. And it breaks my heart for those people. You know, and Paul said, I see these people who are that way and I weep for them. You know, I'm concerned about those people, but you know the people I'm even more concerned about? Don't get me wrong, I'm concerned about the lost in the world. But the ones that really break my heart are the thousands of people who are sitting in church pews this morning who are just as lost as they can be. That is heartbreaking. They're sitting in the service this morning singing, Christ, we do all adore thee. We're singing, how great thou art. And they are farther from Christ than they can imagine. And yet, they feel like, hey, I'm in church this morning. I'm here. I'm great. I'm not judging anybody's heart. Okay? I'm just saying, generally speaking, there are people who are going through the practice of being church. There are people who are going through the motions of being church. And this is the only time that they're not living in the world. They think. But the reality is, even in a church pew, they're still living in the world. Because their heart is in love with the world. See, it's easy to check off the box of, quote, going to church. That's an easy thing. It's really simple to quote, go to church. All you got to do is get up in the morning, get your clothes on, comb your hair, brush your teeth, and get in the car and go to church. That's easy. Anybody can do that. And a lot of people, I fear, think that's enough. When in reality, it's just a brief little break from the world. My heart breaks for all the people in the church pews this morning who are so far from God. Now, it breaks for the people who don't care, who breaks for the people who are lost. But y'all, I'm going to tell you, we cannot love the world and give God a nice place to live in our hearts. We just can't. So there's no room for any of that. Listen one more time. The world is passing away and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God, what happens then? They abide forever. He who does the will of God abides forever. Yeah, that's the beautiful part of it. The world passes away. The world is gone. The world's behind. But we live for God. We are His. We abide forever. Can you just imagine what it's going to be like to be at the foot of the throne forever and ever and ever? Can you imagine how wonderful that's going to be? To be at the foot of the throne of God forever. Or how horrible it would be, how dreadful it would be to be separated from God forever. Because we just couldn't break up with the world. No, that's it. That's it. That's done. That's all. I want us to do something, okay? I want us to do something as a church family. Because I feel like this is probably one of the best things we can do for each other. I want each one of us this week to be very deliberate about praying for each other by name. And not just, God, please be with our church family. I mean, that's a wonderful prayer. I'm not discounting that at all. But pray for each other by name. Just get your directory, have you need to do it, and pray for our family by name. Because, church, I'm going to tell you something. There is no greater power in the world than having your name spoken before God. No greater thing in the world than to have your name lifted up to our Father in prayer. And so if each one of us will pray for each one of us, but it might take all week to get to the directory. You know what? If you do it all at one time, that's great. If you break it up, if you do it 25 times, that's great. But there's so much power in having your name spoken before God. And there's so much power in just praying for each other that we can love God and break up with the world. That's my request. That's my prayer for us this week, that we pray for each other fervently by name. That's it. Let's do that. We'll be shocked, we'll be amazed at the growth and the power and the encouragement that we receive from those prayers. Chris, let's stand and sing.